Thank you very much. I'd like to give you a Franciscan greeting because I am a Franciscan, and we greet everyone by saying peace and all good to you this evening. It's a great honor to be asked to come and speak here at this university, and especially on the nearing of the 50th anniversary of the Second Vatican Council. It's important that we situate the Second Vatican Council in a long line of different synods throughout the course of history. And its position is a very unique position because it was not dealing with doctrinal issues, it was dealing with pastoral issues about the presence of the Church in the modern world today. And so much of what has happened during that council, what led up to the council, and what happened during the council is very important for what has happened in our days today. The innovative teaching of the Second Vatican Council shows a living tradition of the Church that comes from generation to generation, especially in the search for the unity of all those who believe in Christ. Not only was this a very important landmark for relationships between Christians, but the Second Vatican Council opened up a whole new era of relationships with other religions. And I'd like to speak a little bit about those this evening. However, a critical approach is very important because it will reveal that the hopes and the challenges of the Catholic Church at that period of the Second Vatican Council, because today we, in many cases, treat it as a historical fact, when some of us live through it as an event. And there is a lot of different energy at one phase as it is in the other. Today people take the texts off the book, blow the dust off, and then start reading it. But some of us actually lived as they were being written. The issues are very important because today, to understand the Council, we have to understand that each sentence of the Second Vatican Council was a conclusion of a debate, a very profound debate that changed the lives of many people and, of course, the course of history. It was the Council's concern for the unity and for opening up new avenues for the development of relations with other religions that spurred on the developments that have given us new hopes, but brought about new challenges for the Catholic Church and its continued renewal. In the face of secularization, that is, the context in which religious symbols no longer have meaning for society, the analysis of the sciences we study, religion, anthropology, and phenomenology, help us to understand the presuppositions of communication. The dialogue with non-Christian religions is different from the inter-Christian dialogue. Today there is a new approach to religion and its role in society. It is the human person who is the subject of the dialogue, and for this we need to suppose the anthropological foundation for all dialogue. Before looking at the theological and ecumenical aspect of dialogue, we need to treat briefly some aspects of the phenomenon of dialogue from the epistemological and anthropological points of view. Now, why is this important? It is important because to situate what happened at the Second Vatican Council, we have to realize that there was a great shift in the way people were thinking about religion to begin with, and then secondly, to see what that shift meant in terms of how the Council itself would be received. So my first point is looking at the anthropological dimension. The human sciences, sociology, psychology, anthropology, help us to understand the very dynamics of what we call dialogue in the human sphere, even before we can consider dialogue on a religious and ecumenical level. It is not possible to explore this dimension completely here, because so much new material in terms of method and epistemology has been developed over these past 50 years. What I will try to do is to present some important points that could be helpful for us in the exploration of the nature and exigencies of theological dialogue today. Over the past century, we have discovered the inadequate use of human sciences in the study of religion. Far too often, there has been difficulty in distinguishing the role of the person, of society, and of culture in the study of religion. It was in the context of this difficulty that we discovered the limits and problems posed by scientific rationality in the study of religion. Past studies of religion sought to find a common denominator of all religion and religious experience. Hans Gadamer spoke of existing prejudices and scientific dogmatisms that existed in the methodology of the natural sciences. The attempt of the past was to scientifically define religions. This represents the use of a reductive method, that is, to say the minimum about religion. Obviously, this approach was based on the prejudice about religion as simple phenomenon. This method, therefore, ignored the complexity of the religious phenomenon. The older approach to religion was to study religion by studying the objects of religion, searching for that which linked all religious manifestation to each other. Late in the 1800s, already new theories were beginning to surface, and a new approach was moving away from the study of the artifacts of religions towards the study of the human element. No longer were experts interested exclusively in religion per se, but rather in homo religiosus, the religious subject. The religious experience is composed of subjects and persons, and not primarily of objects. It was this religious person that became the subject of the sciences of religion. We begin to speak of a hierophany, the manifestation of the divine and of the sacred. A theophany, the manifestation of a personal God. And of an anthropophany, a useful concept to express the unedited authenticity of the human person, namely that the manifestation of God had produced, or was more transparent now, through the human person as that person was perceived in these experiences. How one is understood, especially the authenticity of the person that was grasped in the manifestation and in the encounter. In other words, instead of focusing our attention exclusively and principally on the artifacts of religion, we began to focus our attention on what happened to the human subject who entered into contact with the sacred or the divine. Obviously, I am limiting my reflections here in this presentation only to the monotheistic religions where we can speak of revelation and encounter with a personal God. There are other issues that would need to be considered in looking at other religions which we cannot explore here. In this interaction, the anthropological roots of religion demonstrate the structural capacity of men and women to relate to a transcendent reality that defines new values for them. This religious dimension engages one for his or her whole life and is not just restricted to the religious sphere of activity, that is, production of ritual, for example. It engages the whole person and the universe of that person, the individual, the society, the culture, as well as his or her personal life and responsibilities. The sciences of religion, and we might also add here liturgy, which is considered as a science, in the past studied religious production, literally interpreting the meaning of objects instead of interpreting the spirit that had produced it. This religious formalism impeded the comprehension of the contents of the prehistory of men and women. This is the reason why etymology is very important for research, since it seeks the cultural particularity while science seeks the common basis of the phenomenon. For example, the Gilgamesh myth of creation is different in Babylonia and in Israel precisely because it comes from different cultural experiences. Israel was distinguished from other peoples because their God speaks. The others, their idols, have mouths but cannot speak. Or again, we can think of the Trinity and its diverse understanding in Islam and Christianity. A basic rule would be that we need to allow the individual religious experiences to speak and not begin to interpret them on the basis of presuppositions. Attention given to homo religiosus brings us to a recognition of a new scientific methodology that we need to apply. That brings me to my second point, the question of philosophy of language and religious discourse. Modernity has produced several new approaches to science and to reality, often in rapid succession due to the almost instantaneous transmission or communication of ideas in real time. We might say that theories of deconstructionalism have been predominant in the last half of the last century, which has led to a large amount of fragmentation, since almost all norms of continuity, discontinuity were dismantled, something like peeling an onion open. Once all the layers of that onion have been peeled back, we are left with what? The so-called precision of scientific language, in spite of its claims, oftentimes led to the loss of meaning. What was formulated by a philosophical system that was identified as structuralism began to be reacted to, and a shift began to occur from a scientific ideology to new types of epistemology. From a principle of separation, we begin to see a move to a more positive, constructive dimension of understanding reality, which included a pars constituens, a constitutive part. Thomas Kuhn proposed a theory that revolutionized the scientific way of thinking with what he called a paradigm shift. Kuhn and others proposed an epistemology that was anarchical, often negating values in every method. What was proposed was an intentional network whereby touching one part of the network causes modifications in another part of the network. This is, if you want, the beginning of the idea of globalization. In my opinion, one of the more important thinkers of the last century was a French philosopher by the name of Paul Ricoeur, who, unlike some other philosophers of language, attempted to restore an ontological dimension to the science of hermeneutics. What most linguistic analysis denied, Ricoeur affirmed, namely, the verifiability of religious language. This was possible because he understood that religious language was meaningful and reliable. Meaningful because it is impossible to exclude life beyond death, and reliable because it was founded upon the basis of reasonable trustworthiness of the plausibility of the witness. Language does not only have its sole meaning in the verbal expression, but indicates the very complexity of the experience that is composed of word and life. Religious language, properly reevaluated in light of an eschatological verification, demonstrates the reasonableness of believing and therefore its credibility. One may argue from this language based on experience. In this context, the purpose of dialogue is to clarify the definition of common shared concepts. The new epistemological approach to religion and religious language also serves for the mutual verification necessary in dialogue. Obviously, the question of meaning arises at this point, and hence the question of interpretation. We cannot interpret by ourselves because we are living in a realm of intersubjectivity. Intersubjective meaning cannot be the property of a single person because meaning is rooted in social practice. Both the ideas of convergence and consensus are different from intersubjective meaning. Intersubjectivity is a constitutive process, enabling openness to new possibilities. For example, conflict can be constructive and consensus might avoid conflict. For Ricoeur, texts and contexts are always a question of event, not just discourse, but also dealing with action. Both texts and contexts are expressive events. Behind them, all kinds of meanings that are detached from the subject. For an event, whether in discourse or action, to find meaning, you must interpret. In interpretation, you are immediately there, present. Interpretation renders us contemporary, usually in a fresh and new way, even if the text is 2,000 years old. In interpretation, there is disclosure, namely, grasping the world that is opened up by the event. Disclosure is appropriation, namely to make what was alien one's own. The matter of the text only becomes my own if I disappropriate. This is a paradox. To disappropriate means to give up one's own pet interpretation for a wider interpretation. In other words, what we think might be going on might not be going on. In this way, an interpretation bridges and brings together. A classic piece of literature is a composition of texts and actions in front of which we stand. These test us rather than we testing them, since they have open-ended possibilities for interpretation. The test of interpretation is whether or not it leads us to disclosure. We shall return to these ideas when looking at interreligious dialogue. With these brief preliminary notes from the point of view of the social sciences, we can now turn our attention to the problem of dialogue and to its necessity in the ecumenical and interreligious field. So my fourth point is nature and finality of ecumenical dialogue. In seeking to illustrate how dialogue is truly part of human interaction, and possibly say that it constitutes an important element of the nature of Homo sapiens, Homo religiosus, a Homo symbolicus. In the context of divided Christianity, dialogue as a primary part of human activity becomes a crucial part of the existence of the Church. Part of the fundamental mission entrusted to the followers of Jesus is to enter in a continual dialogue with the world. This is the renovation that Second Vatican Council wanted to bring to the forefront, that the Church had become isolated from the world and it needed to be inserted back into the world. The incarnation can be already considered an important dimension of the dialogue that God established with each one and the whole human race. The love of God is so profound for this, His created world, that He sent His only Son to speak the love of God, not in the language of God, that we would not be able to understand, but rather He spoke of it in our language, assuming our human condition. At the core of this love, that is found in the full realization of the mission of the Word incarnate, is the centrality of listening. Here, the entirety of the human person is engaged, hearing, mind, and heart, and is demonstrated in the readiness to welcome the Word and to live it. On the one hand, the Scriptures present us with a listening God, and who even promises to listen to the words of humanity addressed to Him. God hears the cry of the poor and responds. The actualization and realization of this listening God is found in Jesus. Finally, in this dynamic process of speaking and listening, we discover the action of the Holy Spirit, who renders humanity capable of listening and speaking and even crying out, Abba. At the human level, each person creates dialogue as a privileged means for the establishment and development of understanding, respect, reciprocal love both for groups and for individuals. For this reason, dialogue is seen as one of the principal means of obtaining values of quality in every sphere of human society: politics, economics, social, and religious. How much more is this true for the religious sector of human activity? Dialogue exists for assessing the deepest comprehension, to be understood as to understand, to be interpolated as to interpolate, to be gracious and receptive to the other. The aim of dialogue on a subject or a project is to progress toward a community of life and of greater realization. This means that the reciprocity is an essential element for dialogue. For dialogue then to take place, an adequate philosophical reflection is needed. This requires the discipline of epistemology, logic, and linguistics. The latter is necessary to secure the capacity to listen and to speak in an intelligent way. At the basis of dialogue is the desire to be understood. This desire is as necessary as is the capacity to express one's positions and those of one's ecclesial tradition clearly and with precision. As the Directory for the Application of the Norms of Ecumenism, written in 1993, says, they seek to understand the roots of such differences and assess to what extent they constitute a real obstacle to a common faith. To do this, scientific instruments are necessary, as, for example, philosophy, the human science, theology, and the ecclesiastical sciences. When we speak of ecumenical dialogue between Christians, we are aware that there are exigencies and aims to follow. Christians need to learn to grow together in the sharing of the reality of Christ and His church. In this way, we may discern the common elements in their different ways of encountering revealed mystery and translate it into thought, life, and witness. In dialogue, Christians must learn to give a common witness to the mission of Jesus Christ entrusted to His church so that the world will believe. Since the world puts the same questions to all the churches, in listening and understanding together, by means of dialogue, they need to seek a common answer together in such a way that the Lord and His Spirit expect them to serve the world, especially there where the gospel still has not been preached. The churches are placed before the same questions from their internal life. Such questions concern the laity, ministry, liturgy, catechesis, the Christian family, and so forth. Isn't the Holy Spirit inciting Christians to respond together to these dynamics and demands? Thus, one understands that ecumenical dialogue is not restricted to an academic level or is purely intellectual, but desires to attain a more full communion among Christian communities, a common service to the gospel, a tighter collaboration at the level of thought and action. It serves for transforming mentalities, ways of acting everyday life of these communities. Hence, dialogue aims at the preparation of the way of their unity of faith in the midst of the church, one invisible. Then, to cite the Council, when the obstacles to perfect ecclesiastical communion have been gradually overcome, all Christians will at last, in a common celebration of the Eucharist, be gathered into the one and only church in that unity which Christ bestowed on His church from the beginning. We believe that this unity subsists in the Catholic Church as something she can never lose, and we hope that it will continue to increase until the end of time, from the Decree on Ecumenism, number 4. The importance of dialogue for the Catholic Church is obvious from the diverse ecumenical collaboration that the Church has been engaged in by the Second Vatican Council. The intensification of the experience of dialogues has begun to bear fruit as is noted in the Ecumenical Directory. Ecumenical dialogue allows members of different churches and ecclesial communities to get to know one another, to identify matters of faith and practice which they share and points on which they differ. As a further example of the progress that has been noted is the work of Cardinal Casper entitled Harvesting the Fruits. I had the honor of working on that piece of literature where we tried to bring together what we have done in the last 40 years of dialogue, namely what decisions have been arrived at, what are agreed texts, what still needs to be done. My fifth point is looking then at the theological dialogue. All the documents of the Second Vatican Council place the accent on the importance of dialogue. The Council warned that nothing is so foreign to the spirit of ecumenism as false Irenicism, in which the purity of the Catholic doctrine suffers loss and its genuine and certain meaning is clouded. Unity cannot be the fruit of compromise, but must be researched in a dialogue with other Christians, founded on love for the truth, profound Christian charity, and humility. Therefore, theological dialogue engages both the fact of listening and explaining, both with the intent to understand and to be understood, to be true to oneself and trusting on that which others have to say is also the truth. There cannot be hidden agendas. Both the Council and Pope John Paul II emphasize that. At the same time, the Council asks that the manner and method of expounding the Catholic faith should not be a hindrance to dialogue with our brothers and sisters. One would need to be aware of the way of thinking and the actual historical experiences of the other side. In pursuing the theological dialogue, then, there are some principles indicated by the Council and presented in the Ecumenical Directory, as well as being confirmed in the encyclical Ut Unum Sint. These are vital for the success of such an important field of ecumenical activity. The first of these principles is described in the Decree on Ecumenism. When comparing doctrines with one another, they should remember that in Catholic doctrine there exists a hierarchy of truths, since they vary in their relationship to the fundamental Christian faith. Thus, the way will be opened by which, through fraternal rivalry, all will be stirred to a deeper understanding and a clearer presentation of the unfathomable riches of Christ. This is number 11 from the Decree on Ecumenism. We can also take into consideration a second principle of great importance in dialogue, namely the distinction between the deposit of faith and the formulation of doctrine. Different ways of expressing a doctrine may simply correspond to diverse words for expressing the same concept. John Paul II wrote concerning such a proposal, "Intolerant polemics and controversies have made incompatible assertions out of what was really the result of two different ways of looking at the same reality. Nowadays, we need to find the formula which, by capturing the reality in its entirety, will enable us to move beyond partial readings and eliminate false interpretations." From his letter Ut Unum Sint. A third principle is expressed by the same Pope in the following declaration. This journey towards the necessary and sufficient visible unity in the communion of the one Church willed by Christ continues to require patient and courageous efforts. In this process, one must not impose any burden beyond that which is strictly necessary, making reference to the Acts of the Apostles. Unity does not mean uniformity. There is room for legitimate diversity. One of the problems in the ecumenical sphere today is to come to some kind of agreement on what are burdens that go beyond the gospel. My sixth point is reception and the dialogue results. Since the Second Vatican Council, the Catholic Church has entered in a serious theological dialogue with representatives of the other principal churches and ecclesial communities. A certain number of agreed statements have already been published, but relatively few of these have been examined and received by the churches in question. There is a growing awareness that much more must be done by ecclesiastic authority to promote the diffusion, the study, and the eventual reception of the dialogue results. In his encyclical Ut Unum, St. John Paul II focuses attention on that which he calls this new task. The results of dialogue cannot simply remain declarations of bilateral commissions, but must become now part of common patrimony. Since we are treating a question of faith, a universal consensus is required, extending from bishops to the lay faithful, all of whom have received the anointing of the Holy Spirit. In the same Spirit who assists the magisterium, and it is the same Spirit who assists the magisterium and awakens the sensus fidei. The Pope describes the process of analyzing the results and submitting them to the test under the light of the apostolic tradition with these words. This process, which must be carried forward with prudence and in a spirit of faith, will be assisted by the Holy Spirit. If it is to be successful, its results must be made known in appropriate ways by competent persons. Significant in this regard is the contribution which theologians and faculties of theology are called to make by exercising their charism in the Church. It is also clear that ecumenical commissions have very specific responsibilities and tasks in this regard. The whole process is followed and encouraged by the bishops and the Holy See. The Church's teaching authority is responsible for expressing a definitive judgment. In all this, it will be of great help methodologically to keep carefully in mind the distinction between the deposit of faith and the formulation in which it is expressed, as Pope John XXIII recommended in his opening address at the Second Vatican Council. Now I'd like to turn my attention to interreligious dialogue in my next point, which I've entitled Dialogue is a Learning Journey, a Case Study. Many trips have been taken to concentration camps by groups of Jews and Christians together. This journey may be described as a learning journey. Learning because we were both moving from unlearned things about each other, and at the same time learning or maybe relearning some things that either were new or had been forgotten. At the heart of this journey, there still remains the horrific experience of the Shoah. As pointed out by those who have had this experience, this is a good example of what kind of learning has to be done and what kind of journey must be taken. For many decades in the last century, the experience of the Holocaust was like an ominous black shadow hovering over the generations of men and women who were its survivors, who are its living memory. For other persons, it was a historical event that had been sanitized, and unfortunately, in some cases, rationalized by theories which, by any standard today, would be labeled as insane, demonic, or evil. Obviously, the memory of the Holocaust was kept alive in the Jewish household in a different way and from a different perspective than for non-Jews. The unfortunate fact is that there was no exchange between the two communities' way of presenting the historical event. And so each told the history as they saw it and from their perspective. In the recounting of this history, oftentimes there was no place for the other because it was about me and not the other. It was only toward the end of the last century that a learning journey began to happen. I call this a journey because it was a displacement from one place to another, both in the physical sense of the term, as well as in the spiritual and anthropological sense. It is still too early to describe this as a dialogue, because in many respects there was not an exchange between the two partners or persons yet, because only one side of the experience was being represented. It was only gradually when both sides or partners began to realize that the memory of the Shoah had other details, other actors who had the same experience. We must be careful not to affirm that the experience was the same for both partners, since this would amount to a distortion of the reality and of the truth of what happened, but rather to realize that there was a solidarity in the sin of what happened, even though the perception of what happened is different. What the experience of the dialogue as learning journey proves is that no one person or group possesses the whole of the experience or of its memory. What is essential is that in this dialogue, each is allowed to share their part of the memory of the story, and in turn allows it to be completed by the other. Together, and only then, will we have the whole story as part of our collective memory. Moreover, this learning journey will also make room for the pain of the past. It will create a space for forgiveness. It will require reconciliation in the sense of finding shalom again in our relationships. For this to happen, there is an urgent need for a healing. This does not mean a cancellation of memories. My next point is on the healing of memories. It is at this point that we need to raise the question of the healing of memories. Far too often we return to some stumbling block raised from the dark of our past, our historical memories. It may be useful to make a reference here to return to the philosopher Paul Ricoeur. He has offered some very intriguing ideas in an essay prepared for the European Parliament in the whole process of unity of Europe. He speaks of the need to reach the very memory of humanity and to seek its healing. It is in this context of the future of Europe that he raises the point of the inability of peoples to go beyond their past. Needless to say, he does not propose that we forget or cancel our past. This would be irresponsible, since we always learn from our past. However, the dangerous hurts that reside in our memories need to somehow or other be healed. In the Judeo-Christian tradition, we cannot give up our memories, since it is there that we encounter God. But how do we encounter God there, except in and through our own proper histories? This is precisely where the problem arises. When we recount or retell our histories, we often do so with selective memories. We tell the things which we want to emphasize or which will support my point of view, even puts us in a more favorable light. What is happening is what is being established is what Ricoeur calls a narrative identity of those who were involved in the story. For example, it becomes easy to vilify one or the other depending on who is telling the story. The sequence of events can be reordered and thereby given a different twist, or as is said in journalistic jargon, a different spin on things, by the other who recounts the same story. This effect is referred to as mobile identity. All you have to do is listen to political debates going on at the time of elections. We're experiencing this in the United States, of how these types of identities are being created and being spun, depending on whose point of view you want to follow. This is what we do when we tell the history of others, why we have several versions of the same event retold. Ricoeur says this: if each one receives a certain narrative identity from the histories which are told of them, or that they tell of themselves, this identity is mixed with that of others in such a way as to engender stories on a second level, which are themselves the intersection between several stories. To put it another way, every history of an individual or of a religion is at the same time a segment of the history of the life of the other. What needs to be done then in the context of the reconciliation or exchange of memories is to translate with imagination and sympathy the history of the other. The mobile identifications contribute to the reconfiguration of our own past and of the past of others through a constant remodeling of the histories which we tell about ourselves and about others. What is needed as one of the first steps of a dialogue is the beginning of the retelling of our stories, but this time together. In this process, words alone will be insufficient, because it is not by the composition of new histories that the wounds of the past will be healed and the corrections of misperceptions righted, but rather by pardon which will be granted. This is perhaps the most powerful aspect of this putting into practice. Ricoeur sees the importance of tradition at this juncture. What he understands by tradition is transmission of things said, of beliefs professed, of norms assumed, and so forth. However, such a transmission is only lively if tradition remains the other partner of the pair which it forms in innovation. This innovation is the indispensable part of the dynamic listening and liberating the future from tradition. For we cannot simply repeat what we have received, lest we betray that which we have received, but we must constantly reinterpret what we have received for our generation and the next. This is the way in which tradition becomes intelligible and living. Another element that is necessary in this whole process is the need to embark on acts of repentance leading to pardon and forgiveness. My next point deals with repentance, conversion, and pardon. The healing of memories passes through a process that ends in pardon. Ricoeur treats a model of pardon as something central to the healing of memories. At the heart of the covenant promise made with Israel is the offer of pardon. At the heart of the gospel is the call for forgiveness. Starting from this perspective, Ricoeur understands the model of pardon as a new way of revising the past, and through it also the narrative identity of each one. Seeing these personal histories, stories, pasts being intertwined is likewise a way of seeing that these histories and stories and pasts must be held together. This is where we can see the real fruit of the exchange or healing of memories taking place. Ricoeur says that pardon is likewise a specific form of this mutual revision from which deliverance of promises not kept in the past is a very precious effect. What I'm suggesting here is not a cancellation of the past, but rather a going beyond those things which tend to perpetuate a state of alienation, and hence not creating a space for the other. In this sense, then, we may talk about changing our common future. Permit me to cite the intuition of Ricoeur once again. The exchange of memories required by our model demands, according to this new model of pardon, the exchange of the memory of suffering inflicted and experienced. Now, this exchange requires more than the imagination and sympathy that I evoked above. More than anything else, it has something to do with pardon, to the degree that pardon consists in releasing the debt. The poetic power of pardon consists in the releasing or the breaking of the debt, of the law of irreversibility of time, changing, if not the past as a collection of things that happened, at least its meaning for men and women of the present. It does this by removing the weight of the guilt which paralyzes the relationships of men and women acting and suffering in their own history. It does not abolish the debt, since we are and remain the inheritors of the past, but it removes the suffering of the debt. In his reflections at the Fourth European Day of Jewish Culture, Cardinal Kasper noted that especially with regard to anti-Semitism and to the Shoah, we, the Church, can justifiably speak of the need to embark on acts of repentance, which ends in the exemplary and concrete acts which as members of the Church we are linked to all the sins as well as the merits of her children. From the document We Remember. This is how we need to interpret what John Paul II did on March 12th in the year 2000 and reconfirmed on March 26th in Jerusalem at the western or Wailing Wall of the Temple. A recent example of this among Christians was the meaning of the return of the relics of two of the most important holy men to the Orthodox world, to the Patriarchate of Constantinople. Some of you know in the Basilica of St. Peter, there are the relics of St. John Chrysostom and Gregory the theologian. And these were returned to the Patriarch of Constantinople. This gesture did not erase the past, but it enabled us to tell the story of how these precious objects arrived where they did. It was a moment of confronting our Western history with the Orthodox, which enabled each side to retell their recollection of the events and to verify where the truth lies in relationship to this page of their common history. This was only possible after years of difficult dialogue and with the possibility of opening a space for the other, even though it was ever so small. What this historical event symbolized was the possibility of both dialogue partners being able to be true to their memory without falsifying the memory of the other. This is one of the central issues of the type of theological dialogue that we need to have between Christians and other faiths. How can I be true to my own faith without being false to yours? The question now leads me towards my conclusion. In this expose, I hope I've been able to stimulate some ideas of the requirements of dialogue in general, but also have shown the dynamic of the Second Vatican Council, which has enabled us to be where we are today. I hope I have been able to show that every culture and place has its own requirements. It is clear for me that those who are engaged in ecumenism as well as in interreligious dialogue have the serious obligation of a complex preparation and a serious one. The field of ecumenical activity requires a multidisciplinary preparation as well as men and women with the capacity to be open and proceed together with others on a path towards reciprocal listening and dialogue in respect for others, but even more in respect for the truth. I would like to simply state that some ideas concerning the context of interreligious scene today and what is urgently needed in the Church to be able to deal with issues that arise in these settings. First, we need to realize that interreligious as well as ecumenical scene is a pluricultural context. In this context, we desperately need to define the fundamentals of the relations I and other, and to emphasize the necessity of relating with the other, abandoning hostility so as to arrive at hospitality grounded in love. Catholic identity is important in the interreligious dialogue to understand the journey that the Church made to open up the dialogue by walking with other religions. Christians need to remember that it is the love of Christ that exhorts the Church to reach out to every human being without distinction. In a multicultural and multi-religious society, it is indispensable to know the identity of the other and to dialogue on all that is common to us. This means creating a space for the other and to initiate a new phase of history that allows for the writing of history together and the construction of a world in the measure of the human person. We need to begin with acts of penitence that brings us to pardon. I have suggested with Recur that the model of pardon is central to a healing of memories. It is a new way of revisiting the past. It is through pardon that a narrative identity of each one is created. It is an exchange of the memories of suffering inflicted upon an experience that touch the imagination and eventually brings a level of forgiveness that consists in the letting go of the debt. This breaks the law of the irreversibility of time, since it removes the weight of culpability that paralyzes the relations of men and women in their proper history. We need to remember that this does not abolish the debt, but removes punishment due the debt. Perhaps the greatest challenge to the Church today is the need to provide education for the clergy, who in turn will form the faithful on how to shed light on ignorance that we have of each other. This ignorance generates fear of the other, which eventually degenerates into finding ways of eliminating the other. This may be done by examining the texts of history, catechesis that we write, and the liturgies that we celebrate and the sermons we preach, which often are bearers of prejudices. We desperately need to study the sacred texts of other religions, beginning with the Hebrew Scriptures and the Qumran, and the traditions that are born from these. This is the beginning of understanding and the dispelling of fear because of ignorance. When I say we, this includes all involved, Christian and non-Christian alike. Finally, Nostra Aetate number 3 encourages the preservation and promotion of peace, liberty, social justice, and moral values. From the Christian perspective, this is actually realizing the task that Jesus entrusted to the Christian community of overcoming the spirit of the world by living the spirit of the Beatitudes. In all of this is the dynamic and the challenge that the Second Vatican Council puts before us, and we know how far we have come, but now we see how far we must still go. Thank you for your attention this evening.
And so we have a few minutes if you have any questions that you'd like to ask. I would just ask you to use the microphone in the middle of this aisle.
And all the hard ones I'm going to pass on to Sister Susan to answer.
I think I have.
Could you sit? Yes, please.
Thank you for your event this evening. I just have a question around the introduction of the new Roman Missal in the Catholic Church and what effect you feel that might have on ecumenical dialogue and partnership.
Well, that's a very interesting question because where I sit, which is on the other side of the Atlantic, it looks different than it does when you're here experiencing it. We haven't had many direct interventions by our dialogue partners yet, but certainly before, when certain other documents were issued, there was a real sense of depression that set in because our dialogue partners said, we have learned so much from the Catholic Church and your experience of worship that we feel now that we are abandoned because you say, we don't need you any longer. When many of the English texts have been worked on together with some of the best scholars, with some of the best writers of English, and they had been adopted, including the lectionary, actually the form of the lectionary, in the English-speaking world anyway, by our dialogue partners, that many of them felt that they were really seriously hurt by this. I remember I was asked to go to speak to Cardinal Casper at that time, who said, well, the work of this dicastery, that is for the Pontifical Council for Promoting Christian Unity, is not liturgy. That's not my problem. I said, oh no, wait a minute. The move for common texts came from this office, from Christian Unity. You're the ones who encouraged then Catholics and non-Catholics alike to begin to develop texts that could be used in prayer that we would share in common. If we could not have now the celebration of the Eucharist together, at least we knew that we were using the same prayers with the same words, with the same spirit, and the same thing with the common lectionary in the English-speaking world anyway. We know that on the same Sunday the scriptures are being heard by everyone in the churches, even though that we were not celebrating the Eucharist together. So for them this was a real serious shock. I have to say that I'm very edified by many of these people because I worked with them, so many of them who worked on the common text, but also who've been involved in the dialogues, that they have not given up on us, even though it looks like we have given up on them. And I think that is where we've come so far, that, you know, you still remain my brother and sister, even though you may not be the good brother and sister I would hope you would have. But you have hurt us in a certain way, but you still remain my brother and sister. And so they are willing to walk with us through this period. And I think it is going to be a learning phase for everyone, because our dialogue partners have internal problems that they have to face as well. That has caused problems for the dialogue itself. It has not been a total disaster, but it has not been helpful along the way. But at the same time, there's a serious desire to go forward and not to let this be another obstacle on our way to communion, full communion, in the future. We continue to pray, and I think that's one thing we have to realize when we deal with the question of unity. We are not creating unity, we are waiting for the gift to be given. And the purpose of the Week of Prayer for Christian Unity is precisely that we as Christians prepare ourselves by prayer. One of my professors, Father Congar, said that the way to ecumenism is on our knees, and that means that we pray and we hope that God will, in His time, give us that gift when we are ready for it. None of our churches will be the same. We have to realize that we all will be changed, and that's part of what this means. Thank you for that question.
I've noticed that this is not very theological. This is more coming from an ordinary person in the pews.
That's the best place where it should come from.
But it's been noted by theologians and so forth. Sometimes there's a split in the church between they're more in communion with people in other sects and other communities on the liberal side, and the conservatives seem to band together, and it goes across in the church, but there's more of a split within the church between the liberals and the conservatives. Mm-hmm. And how do you address this? I'm just wondering.
Well, you know, when you deal with extremes, you never find a solution. You have to move towards the center somehow or other. That's where things hold together. Things spin out, and I think that that's one of the prejudices that I spoke about, is putting these labels on people that many times shuts down the possibility of hearing or listening. And so I'm very cautious about talking in those terms. I know we use them in politics many times, liberals, conservatives, etc. And they mean one thing. In terms of religion, they mean another thing. But we have to say, what is the intention of those who are seeking one position or the other? What is it that they feel is being achieved, or what is it that they feel is lacking in their own church? Now, it is true that within our church, things happen that maybe we're not happy with, okay? But we have to take a step back from all of that, I think, and begin to reflect on actually what it is that we're not happy with. And I think that's the most difficult question, because sometimes, you remember the Humani Vitae discussion, that we realized that the reaction of many people to that was only around one small issue of what that encyclical was about contraception, when that encyclical was primarily about the primacy of conscience and how that gets lived out. So I think that there are things that we miss sometimes because we react with great speed to be able to react against something. And in our churches, the fact that we find ourselves, and we discover this in the dialogues, for example, with the Pentecostal churches, that many issues that have to deal with social issues or ethical issues, we feel very comfortable in speaking to Pentecostals about, because they have the same issues. But we are not comfortable speaking to them about other issues. You see? So this is part of, I think, the exchange that needs to go on between our churches. I mentioned something today that comes from an example in the Old Testament that I've reflected on quite a bit, that when dialogue stops, murder takes place. The first example of that in the book of Genesis, when two sons stop talking. You know the event. Okay? So this whole thing is that we alienate one another very rapidly rather than trying to maintain a dialogue and discuss with each other. This is the problem that it happened at the time of the Reformation. We stopped talking to one another, and therefore we started going our own ways. It happened at the time of alienation of East and West. So much so that when Western missionaries went to the Eastern territories, they were shocked by the fact that they said that Christ was present because of the intervention of the Spirit and not the words of institution. So they did not even recognize that there was a different theology, a different way of expressing the same realities. So my solution is that we cannot stop talking to one another. No matter how far those extremes are, we need to always try to find some kind of common ground to be able to maintain some kind of dialogue. And of course, and the bottom line is always that is the respect for the other. Far too often we dismiss someone, well, that one is not serious because she or she holds that position. And so it's on the human level that things begin to break down. And that's what we have to restore, I think. That's one of the reasons why I said towards the end that I felt it was really important, the education of the clergy, especially about attitudes in dealing with other religions and other Christian traditions. Because many times we remain ignorant of their positions.
How can we encourage two parties to partake in dialogue if one party's not even interested in coming forth to the table?
Yeah. Well, you can't force someone, it's like the whole thing, you can't bring that horse there and make him drink water. But the question is that we always leave a space open. And you have to carpe diem, you have to seize when that possibility is there. At my level, it has to happen on the human level. Never mind the intellectual part of it, but do not denigrate them as a human person. And that's what so often happens. We have a program in Rome called Ecumenismo in Erba. Those who speak Italian will laugh at this expression. It's in English we would translate it budding ecumenism or ecumenism in the grass levels. And it's a program that we started teaching children from the ages of 5 to 13 about the values of ecumenism without teaching them about ecumenism. I mean, they can't even say the word. But it's trying to undo the prejudices that they already have learned in home through very subtle ways that their parents have done that. To restore those values which are necessary for ecumenical progress, which is trust, which is honesty, transparency, etc. And we've done it with the help of a child psychiatrist because we cannot create cognitive dissonance between the child and the parent, but to allow the child to realize that there's a different position here in terms of how they need to relate to one another. So to me, this is the basic thing. It's on that human level that we have to begin before you can even get to the question of talking about any other issues.
For your talk.
You're welcome.
There's a lot of new things to me, so it was almost as though every sentence was a paragraph. Trying to keep up with you.
I think I had a couple sentences in a pair.
Well, I would have to get the thought.
No, I know.
But I would be interested in knowing what you think the scope of this dialogue is I once read that there are accepted to be about 30,000 different forms of Christian religions. And I'm wondering what your experience of that is, given that the Catholic Church is global.
Yeah, I'm not sure what that means, 30,000 forms of Christian religions. I thought maybe you might say of religions in the world, but not just Christian. You're talking about denominationals?
Yeah.
I know the Encyclopedia of Christianity, which was issued on the anniversary of the Edinburgh Conference in 2010, and I don't believe there is that many that were there. There are a good number, I have to say, and there are variations of that. But we have to realize, I'll just share an experience. You've heard of non-denominational Christianity, and I think that's what you might be referring to, that there are many forms of non-denominational type of Christianity, some of which carry like Christ for the Nations, names like that. About 10 years ago, one of the leaders of that movement, a very large group, came to us in Rome. It was on Pentecost Sunday, actually, and said, can you help us? Because we realize, as we read the Gospels, that we are called to unity, but our reality continues to divide all the time. So they asked us at the Centro to say how we could do something to talk about this problem. And so I thought a lot about this, and I said, well, I think within the Catholic Church itself, we have a kind of a reality that looks like non-denominational Christianity in certain respects, the way they pray, for example, the way they work in the world. It's called the charismatic renewal. So they say, how can you be, living out of the life of the Spirit and remain united in the church? And I said, well, let's bring together leaders of the charismatic renewal to speak to the leaders of the non-denominational movements to say how they could talk about these things. And the things that we discovered were so many things that we had in common, so that the diversity of forms doesn't necessarily mean that there is really a division in realities. We have confused the sociological reality of the structural element of various denominations, but many of them have the same characteristics. Okay, that doesn't end. But the problem is that some of them divide very quickly because there are dissensions within the ranks. I don't like what my pastor says, and so therefore I take a group of people who are of like-minded and just walk away, and I form my own little church over here. Okay, but really we're the same little church, except that that position I just exclude. So there's a lot of commonality between a lot of these groups, and whether that is the way to go, I'm not sure. It's like taking a hair and start splitting it in many different ways. We have to try to find something that links us all together. And from the Christian perspective, if it is not the gospel of Jesus Christ, and what I try to say at the end, of us realizing as Christians, we must conquer the spirit of the world by living the spirit of the Beatitudes, which is a way that we are to be in the world today. So I think there are a lot of things on many different levels that we can come to agreement with. The dialogues that exist within the Catholic Church are kind of classified on two levels. One, those dialogues that are destined for full, visible unity, and they would be between what we call mainline denominations, the Anglicans, Methodists, Lutherans, Reformed, etc. And for a better understanding of mission in the world would be with the evangelicals, with the Pentecostals, the non-denominational, because structurally there is such a disparity that there was no way of coming to a visible type of unity with them. But in terms of the gospel project of evangelization, yes. So there's two levels that are there, I think, that we have to look at.
Hello, I'm a first year Catholic Studies for teachers at King's College, and I'm a little bit interested about the issue about the lesbian and gay community. And, the liberals have introduced a new plan to introduce the new idea of genders in the religious community, like religious curriculum. So my question to you is, has the Second Vatican Council addressed that, like the problems with the lesbian and gay community?
As per se, no, except for the dignity of the human person. There is a lot that is said about what it is that we have to respect in each person, and I think that is the basic for it. That issue wasn't a hot potato, as you would say, at the time of the Second Vatican Council, but certainly has come to the fore since then, and I think the position of the Church is the respect of the human person, which is the fundamental reality there.
Thank you very much.
You're welcome.
Some of the points that you were making towards the end, you were talking about the necessity for pardon.
Yes.
It was reminding me of something that was written years ago when Pope John Paul II was shot.
Mm-hmm.
He went afterwards to visit the man in the prison that had tried to kill him.
Yes.
And the writer said that one of the things that's really necessary for pardon is that the offender makes a commitment to change their behavior, so that even though the Pope forgave his assassin still had to stay in jail. That he wasn't let out of jail because he was pardoned. Excuse me. And I'm just mindful that in a lot of cases when there have been splits in Christianity, part of the split has been Catholic Church excommunicating others. And in the current church, we have people who are disagreeing with the hierarchy of the church on certain issues, and there's still lots of communities that are disagreeing. So in the case of someone like Father Roger Watt, who was excommunicated for uncelebrating the women, do you see it possible in the near future that the Catholic Church can allow people to stay in the church who disagree with some of their positions?
I think that happens actually now. Those, what you cited were extreme issues because of the fact that they were disciplinary in the sense of violating the law of the church. And I think that, I have to say it this way, with Paul VI and the Humanae Vitae situation, we began to have a diversity of voices speaking. And the concern or the criticisms of Paul VI's pontificate is precisely that the papacy no longer spoke with one voice, that there are many voices. Theologians were speaking, and there was a concern that the Catholic Church doesn't speak with one voice any longer. And so John Paul II, when he was made elected Pope, it was looked like that he began to reel in that. So he began disciplining theologians, and then he began disciplining bishops who spoke critically of his positions. Most of those did not arrive at excommunication, but there was some kind of censure that was put. So there is a tension, a real tension there. What is the issue at stake here? I believe that the concern of the Vatican, anyway, is this, that they are afraid that by people who are theologians that speak a technical language, need to speak in a way that can be understood. And by theologians going to very popular magazines and not speaking in theological or technical magazines, the dialogue that needs to go on among theologians doesn't go on. It goes on a popular level among people who are not prepared to carry on that dialogue. And that's one of the concerns that the Vatican has. Whether that is a legitimate concern or not is another story, because the laity today is in a different place than the laity was 50 years ago. We have a much more informed laity today. We have a much more theologically prepared laity today. So that this tension exists within the church. The church does not excommunicate everyone that disagrees with the church. That's quite clear. If it were, we'd have a lot of people sitting outside looking in. But I think it's only in very strict and definite cases where certain norms were given and they were transgressed that the church acts in that way. Whether it is the right decision or not, that's not really for me to evaluate. I mean, as a theologian, I can say what theologically I think, but I'm not in the position to act on those things. As the hierarchy is, they're the ones who have the control of that aspect of the church's life, the bishops, for example. I think that certain cases, for example, certain theologians in the East who were excommunicated after there was a discussion, they were clearly brought back in with people who were dealing with liberation theology, for example. So I have to say, sometimes I'm surprised by the people who have been emarginated from the church because of that. And lots of times we don't know all the ins and outs of what happens. So I would say, yes, there is a space in the church for people who disagree with the church, but there are ways of disagreeing with the church and ways of carrying on a dialogue with the church. And I think that we need to respect that and carry it out in the proper way.
Hi, I'm also in Catholic studies for teachers, but I'm in third year, so I get placements out in high schools now. And one thing I've noticed about the Catholic high school system is we have a lot of non-Catholics in the system, both other Christians and other denominations. And because hopefully, God willing, in a few years I'm going to be teaching religion, how do you kind of tackle that diversity in a very one-sided conversation where this is the Catholic faith, this is what I have to teach you, this is the curriculum, but a lot of you aren't Catholic?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's very tricky understanding, because you need to know what it is that the curriculum says. Is it a teaching of the faith, or is it teaching about the structure of religion? And I think that's what has happened. I'm not sure about the Canadian system, so I don't want to speak about the Canadian system, but I know in the United States, what happened in Catholic schools, which are generally have a Catholic population in it, that the teaching of religion was teaching about religion rather than teaching about faith. And so there were two different perspectives that took. So you treat more or less a religion as a subject, looking at it from a historical point of view, sociological point of view, psychological point of view, but there was never any talk about what is the faith content of this Catholic faith that's being taught there. Now, if you have the responsibility to teach Catholic faith, then there's a question of conscience about those who have to attend that class who are not Catholic or not Christian, because that happens in many cases. We have a school in Japan, and 95% are not Christian at all. So, but religion is taught in that school, but it was religion taught by Hindus, Buddhists, Taoists, etc. So everyone had the possibility to have a discussion about their own faith in that context. I don't know what the situation is here in Canada, so I can't really respond to that. But I think it's a question of realizing what it is that you are asked to do. Are you asked to teach about religion as a phenomenon, that is sociologically, historically, psychologically, or are you asked to teach about the Catholic faith, which is a different ball game?
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Normally, if you're Protestant or Anglican, you can't receive the Eucharist at Mass. But I'm just wondering if you can explain, at Pope John Paul II's funeral, the first man to receive the Eucharist was Protestant, and he still does receive it every week, I believe.
Well, he's died now, but
He's died now.
yeah.
But he did receive it up till his death. Can you just
Yeah.
explain how that is, just with the community there?
Yeah, the community, it's Raja Schutz, who's the founder of the community of Taizé, which was founded to be an ecumenical community. He was a Reformed pastor. And I'm not really sure if Cardinal Ratzinger was taken by surprise, but when he was wheeled up. But I do know that there was special permission given to the Brothers of Taizé that when they did go to celebrations in the Vatican that they could receive. And it was based on the principle that in extraordinary cases, it wasn't on a daily basis, obviously there were extraordinary cases, that this is permitted under certain conditions. It remains an issue for, I raised this myself, because someone in the Vatican said, well, but he's really Catholic. I said, well, what does that mean? And I said, if you use that argumentation, then why can I not apply it to other people who express a Catholic faith. I mean, they don't express the tenets of all the Catholic faiths, but they express the heart of the Catholic faith. Why are they not allowed? They said, well, because he was really Catholic. I said, well, where is his confirmation certificate? Because that's what that means. And I mean, we have canonical norms within the Catholic Church too, you know. So they were kind of stymied by this. And I said, you can't really use that language. There is a position within the Church that says the Eucharist is the sign of unity, but is also the way to unity. And my position is that, unfortunately, we've only emphasized one aspect of that, which is it's the sign of unity, but we never talked about the fact that it is also a means to unity. And so that I think that we need to have a balance in that presentation and understanding of who can and when can those people receive Eucharist in the Catholic Church. We have certain conditions. Every diocese has norms about that. Some are for questions of marriage or for questions of funerals, etc. So that that's something that I think we need to work on. But I don't think it should be used indiscriminately. Because in many cases, some Protestants, because I live in Italy and Protestants are a real minority. I mean, we're 97% Catholic in Italy. And so they kind of treat the Eucharist as kind of an award. Finally I got to go to the Eucharist. I said, but no, it has to mean something in terms of that, because that's what it means for us. I mean, they could say this is the body of the Lord, but it means more than that in terms of how we relate to one another in the body of Christ. So I think that's something that we need to consider, and I do know that there are exemplary cases when that can be done. You're welcome. Hi.
I really enjoyed your talk.
Thank you.
I have one probably more general question
Sure.
that's been asked so far. Specifically pertaining to dialogue, I'm just wondering that typically when you talk about dialogue and in a context that's outside of the religious arena, it seems to be a little bit easier to come to a situation where there can be a real flow of exchange of ideas.
Mm-hmm.
So you can come with your ideas, someone else can come with their ideas, and there isn't as much, I guess, commitment to those ideas, those concepts, in other contexts. If you had two scientists come together, for example.
Mm-hmm.
So my question really pertains to in a religious context where you have two people, whether they be from different faiths or within the same Christian tradition, or even as someone else said, within the Catholic tradition, conservative or liberal, when they're approaching each other with the intention of dialogue, there almost seems to be more limitation imposed on them because they have a greater commitment to those ideas. So I'd like to ask you, in that context, how do people approach each other in a way that's open for exchange, while at the same time preserving some commitment to the truth that they believe to be resident in their stance?
Mm-hmm. Okay. Well, the first thing is I don't think when people approach one another in dialogue, it's not to convince the other of my side. So, and that's what maybe is different from the outside when we talk about, I know in Italy they talk about an ecumenical agreement among the politicians. It means a compromise. Okay, it means a compromise. So unfortunately they've robbed our word from a technical point of view. But I believe that dialogue is, again, the possibility to encounter the other in his or her truthfulness. That's the grounding point here, is that we seek the truth together. And we also have to realize that the truth can be understood in many different ways. And there are other aspects of the truth. Father Congar again used another example about, he used to call it the Niels Bohr theory of ecumenism. So there you go, rocket science. It was precisely that an element is never itself if one particle is missing. So unity means that you have to have all those particles there for it to be really what it is supposed to be. And so for the Church of Christ to be fully what it is, as long as there is division among Christians, then the Church of Christ is not, no one church is the Church of Christ from that point of view. Okay? Because there's something that's missing. Okay? But that doesn't mean that there is a lack of truth in that. You see? So I believe that in dialogue we approach one another because we are anxious, we are yearning to know the truth from the other. Okay? And that's why in dialogue we have to have people who actually represent their own reality. You know, it's not there that they have an unclear understanding of what their identity is, what their reality is, but they can speak that reality in such a way that it speaks of the truth of who they are, because it's not only an intellectual reality, but it is an ontological reality, that is, I live that reality. As Christians, we believe the faith is a living relationship. It's not a series of precepts that we affirm, but it's how we live that relationship with the Jesus Christ who has called us into his own being. So I think that's what is fundamental from this point of view. That's how we need to approach. If we have a whole baggage that comes with us, then we better be careful that we check that at the coat rack outside someplace and present ourselves there as we are. Because usually in a dialogue one sees whether there's authenticity or not, and that's part of the real question here.
I guess we had one little add-on to that.
Sure.
Do you feel that the church is embodying that kind of an attitude now and moving in that direction?
Mm-hmm.
Because I get, in the past, what I've seen is more of an attitude of we're the bearers of truth to the world, in a sense, and there's this general kind of attitude like they can share it if they'd like, and we're willing to sit here and have that come to us.
Mm-hmm.
Do you feel like there's more of a push in the direction of, from within the church, looking at where the truths that other people have to offer us in that real exchange of truth, or do you feel like we're still kind of stuck in that previous attitude?
Yeah. I guess my first problem is the use of the word church. Because we all have an image, when we say church, we have an image of what the church is or who the church is. How do you approach it? You are church. See, that's where I start from. The church is not some structure someplace far away. The church is here where I live, in that community. So, yes, if we want to say phenomenologically, it might appear that there is an official church that has a certain position that gives that impression. But when you see, even within the workings, because sometimes I hear some of the statements that are being made, it depends who's making them. You know, everyone says, oh, the Vatican has spoken. Well, who in the Vatican has spoken? My question, you know. Because I get interviews lots of time from the radio and stuff like that, and I said, well, can you tell me who said this statement, you know? And what was the context of this? But I know from working alongside of the Vatican, I don't work in the Vatican, so we're independent from that, but the Pontifical Council for Promoting Christian Unity sometimes have a different stance than another dicastery like the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith. So, but they're still speaking to the same institution and they speak two different languages. And I think that's something that causes problems for people outside of the church. Sometimes it causes problems for people in the church, the Catholic Church as it were, so that, you know, there are issues that are raised there. But we have to be able to sit down and pick through that to see really, is this what the church is saying, or is this really what the church's position is? Because in front of that position we have the teachings of the council and we have the teachings of the encyclicals. And so those are the fundamental bases that we have to relate to. So I understand some of your frustration or some of the sentiments that are felt that way, but I always go back to the church is here where I live. What is my church saying? Is what John Paul II said on the Day of Forgiveness in March in the year 2000. And the cardinals were really upset with him that he publicly asked for forgiveness. And he said, you know, is it better that we seek for forgiveness this way than saying someone 10 generations after us asked for forgiveness for something that we've done? Let us be responsible for the way we live our faith today. So I think that's, you know, when we say church, that's the church for me. That's the church, and the church has many faces, as you know, because of this.
Great, thanks.
You're welcome. You're welcome. This is actually worse than my doctoral defense. Excuse me.
Before we bring our evening to a close, I'd like to invite Rabbi Chorny from Or Shalom Synagogue to come forward and express thanks.
Many thanks. I speak from a different perspective. In the Talmudic tradition, there are few, if any, arguments that have ever a conclusion. The entire literature is based on the argumentations and the dialogues, not only between those who see each other face to face, but across generational lines. And very wisely, the Talmud never says who's right, who's wrong. The words are always Elu ve'elu divrei Elohim chayim. These and those are both the words of the living God. I think that the lesson is very clear to us today. Until somebody invents a coin that only has one side, we always have to be prepared to see both sides of each coin and understand the value each side has. We thank you for the knowledge that indeed unity does not mean uniqueness. I picked that one up. Unity does not mean uniqueness, in that it is in the variety and in the diversity of human spirit that we find the beauty of being human and of worshiping the higher being. I'd like to thank you in the name of our center and all those who are present here with a presentation, small token of our appreciation, and to thank everyone who's here tonight for participating and sharing your time with us. Good evening.
Thank you.
And just one more thing before we leave this evening. This lecture this evening is our very last lecture for this academic year. So I'd like to take a moment to just tell you a little bit about next year's lecture series, the theme of which is Faithful Passages, Living Our Faith in a Pluralistic Society. And I'll just tell you a few of the speakers that we have confirmed. The first is Tariq Ramadan from Oxford University in England, Sister Elizabeth Johnson from Fordham University in New York, David Rosen, the chief from the Chief Rabbinic Office in Jerusalem, and David Kurchain from Turtle Island here in Canada. We also have a few other speakers that were just haven't got confirmed yet, so I can't tell you about those. So you will want to get a brochure as soon as they are out. So if you are new to the college this evening and you're not on our mailing list, be sure to sign in before you leave. So thank you very much for your participation this evening, and for many of you who have come faithfully all year long, thank you very much. So we wish you a safe summer when it arrives.
Anticipating.
Anyway, good night. Thank you for coming.
Okay, I think it's fairly simple. There's one.